Hi there. I was just calling in my rich little celebrity impersonation answering machine messages. Just figured I'd redeem this card, though I think it expired about 20 years ago. Since today is Oscar Day, celebrating Oscar's 95th birthday, I thought what better place to begin discussing the Oscars than at the very beginning, the 1920s. Today we'll look at the Best Picture winners for 1928 and also for 1929, because they all had to begin somewhere. And that starting place was Wings. Now, granted, the original Oscars, and indeed for the first several years, did not use calendar years. They instead kind of used a series of weird cutoff dates that I think are insanely complicated, and that was later reversed to calendar years. For simplicity's sake, I'll just say 1928 and 1929, but be aware that that is not the exact, precise way to refer to them, and indeed if you look at Oscar documentation, which we'll get into in a moment here, they wouldn't use that same terminology, but we're going to do it in layman's terms. So, Wings was our, not Best Picture, but rather Outstanding Production for 1928. So technically the first Best Picture winner, even though it wasn't quite called that yet. Wings is an interesting one. When I purchased this video back in about 2010 or so, Wings had really drifted off the radar, and it was very difficult to find on home video for many, many years. Nowadays I think you probably get it on Blu-ray, probably even stream it very easily, but for a long time VHS was the only way to watch it. Wings, of course, is a relatively simple story at heart. Two men, World War I fighters, I shouldn't say fighters, I should say pilots, in love with the same girl, played by 1920s icon Clara Bow. You can see her there, one of her few extant films, and probably the most popular of those. Anyway, both in love with the same girl, both sign up, and we have action and tragedy ensue. There's some incredibly good aerial dogfight sequences, and indeed they actually mounted cameras on the biplanes and had the actors fly the planes and act at the same time. As a silent film, they had no lines to worry about, but they still did get the gestures and the facial expressions and whatnot right. And those scenes have aged really well. Indeed, you can find supercuts on YouTube just of the plane scenes. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of the film. Of course, aerial combat, there would be films made in the wake of Wings that would capitalize on that too. Here's 1930s Hell's Angels, famous for its gross excesses and taking what Wings did and running with it as far as could possibly go. Pretty interesting stuff. But Wings has aged well. Once it kind of came back into circulation, you know, with DVD and Blu-ray releases and whatnot, I think people kind of picked up on that. Although the melodramatic stuff has aged, the action scenes are, even today, really quite good, and probably about as close to World War I dogfighting, aerial dogfighting, not like dogfighting, aerial dogfighting as you could get. Interestingly, there are two scenes in Wings, and even before I actually saw the film, that I was already familiar with. One is a very famous kind of panning shot going through a Parisian cafe, and you see people at different tables. One table, a man is arguing with this girl that he's with, and she throws wine in his face. Another one has a very chic and trendy looking lesbian couple, and one has an older lady paying a much younger man for who knows what. It's a very famous scene, and it was copied for, of all movies, The Last Jedi, as a nice homage. The Canto Blight Casino intro there, panning over all these gaming tables with people engaged in various conversations or various fits over their losses. That was taken right from Wings, and quite well. Another scene that has aged, or I shouldn't say has aged, I should say has kind of transcended age, is at the end when one of our heroes, I won't spoil which one, is dying. His friend gives him a nice kiss on the mouth, and this scene has actually made Wings kind of an LGBT film, which is very strange. It's, and, you know, a World War I aerial combat movie, probably not the first thing you'd think of when it comes to gay interest. But The Celluloid Closet, this documentary here, probably helped to sort of, you know, encourage that, hey, you know, this is a movie that might appeal to an audience besides World War I buffs, who knows. But all told, Wings is interesting, again, if you can look past some of the dated aspects in the acting and stuff. You have some really good effects and whatnot. I haven't watched it in a very long time, but pretty interesting stuff. This was an ex-rental tape. I remember buying this in a big lot at a video store that was going out of business, and I was pretty pleased. This was a good buy. Notice there is indeed a 50-cent charge if you don't rewind the video, so mine is indeed rewound. The nominees of the late 20s, of those first Oscar ceremonies, are kind of up in the air. And as I mentioned before, books such as this, the 1968 Pictorial History of the Academy Awards, you know, sometimes list films that modern sources don't list. The nominees were apparently, you know, considered official by some, not by others. There was write-in candidacy, things like that. The stuff that has now been long obsolete and long out of date. But interestingly, a film that it did run up against was The Racket, a crime drama. This is a really crappy copy of it, but TCM did a nice restoration, which I recorded off TV as a teenager, and I'm glad I still have, because I don't think it's ever been officially released. But I think Wings is much better than The Racket, and some sources, such as that book I just showed you, will cite movies like The Last Command, one of my favorite silent films. Some older sources will say, oh, this was also considered for outstanding production. Others will not. The Last Command, definitely worth a watch, though. One of my favorite silent films, my favorite of the late 20s, so Wings, pretty cool stuff. And I recommend checking it out, especially if you're just getting into silent films. The action scenes should be able to hook you in. Interesting, there's a little bit of nudity in it too, which is surprising for a film of that time, at least a mainstream film of that time. Pretty interesting. So I mentioned outstanding production. The first Oscar ceremony basically split the Best Picture winners into two groups, outstanding production and artistic production. And this way, I guess to put it in modern parlance, stuff like Star Wars and Marvel movies and Avatar, they would all go into the outstanding category, big budget films with a broad appeal, and the more personal, the more art house films, the films maybe with not as much of a budget or not as much star power, would be an artistic. This was the only year this was done, and the Academy officially stated after they merged these two together that Wings was the de facto Best Picture winner. That's what should be considered the first film to win. But in the late 20s, the artistic winner was Sunrise. For many years, Sunrise, also known as Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans, was pretty much neglected by fans. Like Wings, it didn't have a huge home media presence, and this DVD, for example, I showed you that spine earlier, was like a special edition. For a while it was only available in certain collections, or it was a mail-in thing. Nowadays you can get on Blu-ray, and again you can probably stream it, probably even watch it right on YouTube. Actually, it's old enough that a lot of silent films, they can just do that. But Sunrise, like Wings, very simple story. Story of a man tempted by a woman from the city, but not sure if he really wants to give up his wife, and after considering murdering her, realizes that he does indeed still love her. He doesn't want to desert his wife. And they rekindle their romance, and he ends up saving her life at the end of the film. So, a simple story, but Sunrise, as the award implies, is a great artistic triumph. F.W. Murnau, the man who gave us Nosferatu, immortalized through SpongeBob SquarePants of all things, gave us this movie, and it's shot so beautifully. The jokes all land, the dramatic moments work. Nothing that's really going to surprise 2020's audiences per se, but a really interesting artistic expression, and a rare chance, I think, to see George O'Brien play something besides a cowboy. And of course Janet Gaynor, who was one of the biggest stars at the time, very early, and the first Best Actress Oscar winner. I shouldn't say an early one, she was the first one. Good to see them together. It's a very interesting film, and I think if you have an interest in cinematography and art direction and whatnot, you'll really enjoy that. It went up against Chang, Drama of the Wilderness, one of the films that helped shape King Kong. Someday I've got to do a King Kong video, get into all that stuff. It also went up against The Crowd, one of the movies that got me into silent films as a kid. Love The Crowd. It still hasn't received a kind of home media resurgence. I don't think The Crowd's ever been released to DVD or Blu-ray. I think it's still VHS only. Might be available for streaming, I'm not sure, which is a shame. Like Sunrise, it's a simple story, but it's very beautifully made. And I think a lot of people would agree with me on that. So if you're looking to get into the 20s, Good place to start. Sunrise, probably the better film. The Crowd's just more nostalgic to me. But you know, even in the late 20s, by the time the Oscars came along, silent films were on the way out. And in 1927, we get a very famous movie, The Jazz Singer. Often cited as the first talkie. That's not entirely true, because The Jazz Singer doesn't have a lot of dialogue in it. It just has a few scenes with songs and a couple kind of, you know, more conversation bits there. But it gave us that famous line, of course, wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. You ain't heard nothing yet. Which, indeed, would have been the first thing that many audiences would have heard a movie say, which I think is very fitting. But The Jazz Singer paved the way for talking films, especially musical talking films. So it makes sense that our 1929 Best Picture winner, and the first sound film to win, silent films were on the way out, sound films were in, would be a little movie called The Broadway Melody. And The Broadway Melody is, by today's standards, a very tiresome watch. I'll admit I have a good enough time with it when I go in to watch it. Everybody's very enthusiastic, and you can tell they're really enjoying what they're doing with these songs and dances, and the various bits of melodrama where, you know, oh geez, which man is going to end up with which girl and that kind of thing. They're definitely having fun with it. That being said, their enthusiasm does not compensate for a decided lack of talent. Some of the songs are very difficult to sit through. Originally there was color footage in the Broadway Melody. The color footage has been lost. It's the Wedding of the Painted Doll dance, no doubt trying to capitalize on things like the Teddy Bear's Picnic and those kinds of children's songs that could be reimagined as something adults would like to listen to as well. But yeah, I don't know, it's a pretty tiresome dance, and maybe in color would have been more interesting. But you know, it's age, it's a product of its time, but you gotta admit, they're definitely having fun with it, and I guess maybe that's the important part. Here's a spread from another 1960s film textbook. I'll just show you real quick, if I can fix the dust jacket. Show you real quick. Some late 20s photos there of the Broadway Melody. One that, like a movie like Birth of a Nation, it's important from a historical standpoint, more so than entertainment one. And even as early as, my movie's over here, even as early as something like This Happy Breed in 1944, where people go and watch this movie in theaters and they're all like, you know, I can't understand it, but it's interesting. And that's probably kind of how people felt even not long after it came out. Like, you know, this is cool, but just because a movie talks, that doesn't make it especially good. You can't really balance a film's whole reputation on its ability to have spoken dialogue and stuff. I should note that Sunrise does have sound effects and music. Broadway Melody, of course, has full sound, but it still uses title cards and things in some places. They're still making that transition point. When it was featured in 1974's compilation movie That's Entertainment, Frank Sinatra is pretty dismissive of it, remarking that the chorus girls all appear to be slightly overweight. I guess as the chairman of the board he's allowed to say things like that, I don't know. But it's a relic of its time. If you give it a chance, come in with an open mind, you're willing to watch something kind of stupid, I think you'll enjoy it well enough. I know I do. It was up against movies like The Hollywood Review, which I believe remains the only Best Picture nominee that is not a narrative film. It's a series of sketches and skits and songs and things like that compiled into one big movie. It's something very unique, and I think even now, almost 100 years later, there's been nothing else like it nominated. It was also up against the first sound western in Old Arizona, which has aged, but the fact that they're shooting sound outdoors really for the first time is pretty cool. And Warner Baxter, seen here as a Cisco Kid, won an Oscar, and I think quite rightfully. He was able to adapt, I think, quicker than the cast of Broadway Melody was. Still not a great film, but interesting enough. Alibi with Chester Morris, which was on that set I showed you earlier. That was a nominee. Alibi, I think, has aged better than a lot of the other ones because it's at least an interesting kind of crime drama story. And it should be noted, as the last bit here, that many early sound films were also co-produced as silents. I don't believe the silent version of the Broadway Melody is readily available, but you can see other movies like All Quiet on the Western Front, which won for 1930. At least I'll call it 1930. It wasn't technically that, but here's Alfred Hitchcock's Blackmail, and this Blu-ray actually has both the silent and sound versions. You know, small towns, out-of-the-way places, probably didn't get that sound equipment as fast as the major cities did. So please comment below if you're interested in 1920s cinema, or if you have a favorite Best Picture winner. And maybe if this is successful, we'll pick it up again and talk about the 1930s winners. I do hope you find a good film to watch, and have a good week. And we'll talk to you next time. So long for now.